Good morning, this is Marshall Davis. Today we look at the 12th saying in the Gospel of Thomas. This is different from the other sayings that we have looked at in that it deals with the leadership in the early church, but it also contains some spiritual truth, which we'll look at in a moment. This is what the saying says. The disciples said to Jesus, "We know that you're going to leave us. Who will be our leader?" Jesus said to them, "No matter where you are to go to James the just, for whose sake heaven and earth came into being." Now, to understand this saying, first we have to know who this James was that's being talked about here. The name James is an anglicized form of the Hebrew name Jacob, which was a very common name back then. There are several men named James in the Gospel. Who is this James the just, or James the righteous? He's not James the son of Zebedee, one of the top three disciples in the canonical Gospels, Peter, James, and John, also known as James the Great, or the Greater. He died very early in the book of Acts. And this is not James the son of Alphaeus, another one of the original 12 apostles, also known as James the Less. James the Just is almost always identified as James, the brother of Jesus. He was a younger biological sibling of Jesus of Nazareth. Now this we can trust to be true, despite what the Roman Catholic tradition says. It denies that Mary had any other children. That idea was invented by the Church in order to preserve the doctrine of the perpetual virginity of Mary. But according to the Gospels, Mary and Joseph had a bunch of kids. So Jesus had brothers and sisters. The brothers, in fact, are mentioned by name in the canonical Gospels. His sisters are mentioned also, but not by name, in keeping with the fact that women were mostly anonymous in the first century. Now back to the saying in the Gospel of Thomas. The disciples said to Jesus, "We know that you're going to leave us. Who will be our leader?" Jesus said to them, "No matter where you are to go to James the just, for whose sake heaven and earth came into being." It's a strange saying. It does not fit with the rest of the sayings in this gospel. Instead of perennial wisdom, it has to do with leadership in the earliest Christian movement after Jesus' death. Jesus is appointing a successor. It reminds me of the words of Jesus to Peter after his famous confession of faith. Jesus says in the Gospel of Matthew, "I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I'll build my church, and the gates of hell will not overcome it." That saying is identified by most biblical scholars as a later addition that was put into the mouth of Jesus, mainly because of the use of the word church here, and because he seems to be appointing an heir. The same thing can be said about this saying about James in the Gospel of Thomas. For one thing, it says here that the disciples know that he's going away, but Jesus never mentions in the Gospel of Thomas that he's going away. But before this, but here it has it. So that's one clue. Jesus also calls James the just in the saying. Now that was an honorific title given to James much later, not during Jesus' lifetime. So this points to the probability that this saying is a later addition to the Gospel of Thomas. It was added by someone who saw James as the real heir of Jesus, rather than Peter or Paul. So this is not an authentic saying of Jesus. Of course, we cannot be absolutely certain of this. There are so few manuscripts of the Gospel of Thomas, only one complete Coptic text and 3 earlier fragmentary Greek texts, that we cannot be sure what the original manuscript included. But this certainly looks like a redaction. Even though the saying was not spoken by Jesus, it still has something to teach us. For one thing, it testifies to the antiquity of the Gospel of Thomas. For here James was considered to be the head of the church and the successor of Jesus in the earliest Christian community in Jerusalem. That's before the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD. If this saying was added to the Gospel of Thomas, it was added very early, before the primacy of Peter became established. That means that Thomas represents an older tradition than what we find in the canonical Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Those old New Testament Gospels make Peter the head of the church. And very quickly, Paul was seen as an authority, especially in theological matters, above James. The Gospel of Thomas points us, therefore, to an earlier tradition than at present in the other books of the New Testament. The Roman Church followed the tradition of the primacy of Peter by claiming Peter was the first pope of Rome. And it was this Roman Church, later under the Emperor Constantine, that decided in the 4th century which Gospels would be included in the New Testament and which ones would be banned. So it's no surprise that they would include Gospels that give Peter, and therefore the successors of Peter in Rome, the primary role. It's also no surprise that they would ban books like the Gospel of Thomas that said that someone else besides Peter, namely James, was Jesus' choice to succeed him. Yet they could not take out all the evidence of the early leadership of James in the Bible. The earliest New Testament writings are not the Gospels, but are the letters of the Apostle Paul. His epistles give us insight into Christianity before the canonical Gospels were written. In Galatians, which I consider to be the earliest of Paul's letters, and therefore the earliest book in the New Testament, Paul mentions James with Cephas, an early form of the name Peter, and John as the 3 pillars of the church. And he names James first. So there were disagreements in the early church as to who was the true successor of Jesus as the leader. The Gospels say it was Peter. Paul seems to point to James. The Acts of the Apostles elevates Paul above Peter or James, beginning with his conversion on the Damascus Road, which Paul himself claims was a resurrection appearance and therefore qualified him to be considered an apostle. Gospel of Thomas is part of this discussion in the earliest church about the leadership of the church. According to this saying, the disciples came to Jesus and asked who they should look to after Jesus was gone. And Jesus said, no matter where you are to go to James the just, for whose sake heaven and earth came into being. But as I said, I doubt Jesus actually said that. Therefore, we should not look to the teachings of Jesus, of James, as much as we can discern them in the book of Acts and the canonical letter of James. In the book of Acts, James sounds like a xenophobe and a legalist. The letter of James is better, but it still does not have the central spiritual message of Jesus, which was the kingdom of God. And most biblical scholars do not think that the biblical letter of James was actually written by the apostle anyway. Even if the saying was not spoken by Jesus, it is still interesting in what it says about James. James is reported to have said of his brother, "No matter where you are to go to James, the just, for whose sake heaven and earth came into being." That's a remarkable statement to make about James, that heaven and earth came into being for the sake of James. That's the type of thing that Christians might say about Jesus, but not about his brother. And yet that's what Jesus says about his brother. Now, it's possible that the early church in Jerusalem was already starting to deify James the way they deified Jesus, the same way that kings and Caesars were deified, and the way that religions tend to deify their founders. And even some political movements, even today, seem to almost deify their leaders. And maybe that's what was happening here. Or maybe there's a deeper truth that is peeking through. The early church apparently thought, according to this, that Jesus was not the only one for whose sake heaven and earth came into being. And if those words are true of James, who was just an ordinary man, then perhaps it is true of other ordinary men and women. Maybe it's true of everyone. Perhaps this is pointing to the divine nature and origin of everyone and everything, that we are all children of God, that we are all connected to God and to Christ and to each other in God, that our true nature is not these mortal frames and these mushy minds of ours, but the eternal, permanent nature of the universe. In that case, James here represents all of us, ordinary humans who share the divine and human nature of Jesus. Of course, that would have been heresy to most Christians back then and today. And maybe that is why the Gospel of Thomas was banned, and why traditional Christians today cannot accept the Gospel of Thomas. Yet that is why I accept it. And that is it for today. Grace and peace to you.